We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We are going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
Today, we are going to talk about Chapter 1 of Atomic Habits. So I'm sure I'll overlay this on the screen as well, but it's a book by James Clear. And we are not claiming to have written this book. We're just trying to provide some commentary and interesting thoughts, and we're interested by it. So
yeah, absolutely. James Clear first got my attention years ago. He wrote an article. I think it was maybe during. I'm not entirely sure if it was during the 2016 elections or if it was before that, about how to process information and how to prevent yourself from jumping to conclusions when speaking with other people. And it was just a well-timed article given sort of heightened tensions that were rising around the country. I used it a lot pastorally. And so James Clear's kind of been on my radar for a while from his extremely prolific blog at jamesclear.com. I think he says in the book he has 500,000 email followers, which I look at and I'm like, it's a pretty decent email list. So this guy is, there's a little stamp on the book that says it sold over 4 million copies. It's very popular. Been hearing about it a lot and just thought this would be a good one to really think good about,
Yeah, and for what it's worth, this is one that I had a blind eye about. I did not know this at all, so Jack brought this to our attention, and we wanted to look at it.
Yeah, so first impressions. Weston, tell me.
My first impressions? I guess one of my big takeaways, one of the big things I took from Chapter 1 was he labels some concepts that I've been using a lot in my life that I just didn't have a name for. So my first note was on page 13, which after the introduction is the first page of the first chapter. And I said, I've been using the aggregation of marginal gains concept since my teen years, but I never had a name for it. So interesting how he pointed that out on page 13, and that's something I've been doing since I was in high school in terms of just whatever my goal was, I would break it down to the smallest fractional gain that I could make, and I would focus on that, whether that be all the way down to an hour or down to down to a day, even down to the minutes sometimes. I was a huge nerd in high school where I would get some assignment, right? And it would be okay, you have to, they always put word limits on it too, which was dumb, and I think it's dumb and doesn't make sense now, but I'm just going with the requirements in high school, right? So it's okay, I have to write a 500-word essay, and say I only have this hour to do it in class. I would look at it and quickly do the math and be okay, I need to be writing, approximately 1 10-word sentence every minute, and that's how I would approach things. So I've been using that, calculating unit rates and the marginal gains and using those to make sure I'm staying on track with stuff. I've been doing that since I was 16, so I thought that was cool.
So Weston has now spent 840,000 hours analyzing every action that he takes.
Yeah, probably to my own detriment at times, for sure. But yes.
I felt that deeply as well. Clear does put words to things that I do or think about that, and this is what all brilliant communications psychologists really do, I think, is they put words to feelings that exist that you don't know are universal or more broadly accepted concepts, or that have the potential to be principles that you can actually live by. You just kind of think like, I never really thought about that particular concept. But for me, the one was, and we'll talk about this more, because this is definitely going to be my, jumping ahead, my sort of like application from this first section. But the plateau of latent potential was a concept. Basically, the idea is there's a break point at which success takes off, but you have to go through the valley of the how does he put it? The valley of disappointment, or the valley of disappointment.
This is on page, which is like page 21 for our listeners. Yeah. Page 21 is where this shows up.
Yeah, that's where forward progress is happening, but it doesn't feel like it's happening. And as the high school valedictorian, I have struggled against the plateau of my own latent potential my entire adult life, where it's like, you're special, and that's like, am I? I don't see the fruit, right? Like, that's something that I think a lot of people face and feel. And, whether it's on like a personal level or it's a corporate level, it's something that I've experienced in every company I've worked for. It's something I've experienced in the churches that I've worked with, where it's like, why is nothing happening when lots of things are happening? And it's because of that concept. So something I definitely want to talk a lot more about.
I completely agree. That was my second note of things I learned. I said it's a great concept that I have too often overlooked in my life. I agree with you. It's like, I think that there's been some things I've done where I've done a lot of groundwork, and then I just haven't quite gotten to that point where it takes off, And it's also something that I see happening a lot in education that I get frustrated with. But I totally agree, and I'm going to link this in the description, but it reminded me of this song that I really like called Bamboo, and it's by Dane Jordan. If you want to look it up, the link should be in the description below. But it immediately made me think of this song, and he calls it Bamboo because he talks about, like, the concept behind it is, as an artist, he was underground, and he was doing all this work to make himself better, and then he exploded, one day before the earth, and talks about how bamboo is a perfect example of this. And so I've been I'd known that about bamboo, and I thought it was interesting that James Clear brings it up too. It's such a classic example of this idea.
Yeah, I used to work on a landscaping crew and had to remove bamboo, and he's not wrong. The roots go deep, and they go into literally everything before it even pops up out of the surface, which is the example that Weston's alluding to there is just bamboo is this incredibly resilient plant, but it doesn't look like it until it's been growing for a very long time underground. And then all of a sudden it explodes, what do you say, 90 feet into the air?
Yeah. I think it usually takes like 4 years or something before
that's
it
also
even breaks the earth. Like, it's crazy.
It's what did he say? The first 5 years is it builds extensive root systems underground before exploding 90 feet into the air within 6 weeks. That's on page 20. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking about what we learned, this was definitely, and I wouldn't necessarily call this a new learning for me, but like I said, it's just, building a, sort of lexicon for things that are actually happening in your life, right? Like, he talks about the example on page 20 of an ice cube, and that visual imagery just sticks with me so much. Here are two things that I really loved about Clear. One is his analogies are so simple but so applicable, and he has all of these great little one-liners throughout the book that I feel like my highlighting for some books is like you highlight half a paragraph, but with Clear it's like 3 words. And it's just like, yep, that's the point. Like, that's a good point. Masterful writer in that way. But he talks about this ice cube. And his idea is, like, if you're in a cold room, right, and you increase the temperature 1 degree, you will not feel the change. You won't, and the ice won't melt. 27 degrees, 28 degrees, 29 degrees, 30 degrees, 31 degrees. And as soon as you hit 32 degrees, it's not going to feel any different to you. You're still going to be freezing cold. But that ice starts to melt. And, the difference between 27 degrees to 29 degrees to us is imperceptible. But as soon as it hits 32, boom, the ice melts. And that's kind of how he describes this latent potential trap. or the plateau of latent potential is like that 27 to 30 degrees is our valley of disappointment. That's where we're getting up every day, lacing up our shoes and running. That's where we've changed our diet and we've cut out all our junk food. That's where we're like shaking and sputtering and stuff because we've put down cigarettes for a week, but not for a whole year yet. Like those are the areas where you're just, and I think he says too, that's where, it's where bad habits grow, is in the valley of disappointment, because we have not yet codified these things into habitual action that are good. We've just kind of started doing them. And so you have this lag between what you think should happen and what actually really does. And the point that I really like that he brought up is we often expect progress to be linear, but at the very least, we hope it will come quickly. It's a quote on page 22. At the very least, we hope it will come quickly, I think is the place where I have most often gotten lost in this, in my own life. Where, I know that I'm not going to experience changes right away, but I do sometimes think that they should come more quickly than they actually do.
Yep, I feel that. My big note here was trust the process. And I agree with everything you said, and I think something that would be interesting, and I don't know if he gets into it later in the book, is because he kind of addresses it here with the graph on page, it's the first one, I think it's page 16. The graph on page 16 where he's talking about that aggregation of marginal gains and how if we don't do that, like if we're not trying to get 1% better, if we actually get 1% worse every day, how it like brings us to basically zero. Or it's the idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't practice something, you're not going to maintain that. You're either getting better at something or you're getting worse at something. And it's a pretty interesting idea. And I think that the plateau of latent potential, I think that also applies to negative things in our life. So that's what I'm interested to see if he talks about that later in terms of like the example with the ice cube, right? I thought about the example that's brought up with a frog being boiled, right? The classic example from An Inconvenient Truth. At least that's the first place I heard it, which is funny enough. But yeah, the frog will stay in the water, not realizing that it's being cooked or boiled until it's too late. And I think that happens too with some of our bad habits. So I think this book will probably address that at some point. But it's not only is that the way that we make great progress in positive habits, it's our detriment when we have negative habits where we get smacked in the face or you lose. It's like when you have these habits within relationships and you realize that the relationship is over, but it's way too late. You've been doing all these minute little things, these things on the daily that have impacted that relationship, and now it's gone. It's dead, and you can't revive it. So I think that happens too.
Yeah, he does talk about that a little bit, because he says, right after he introduces that topic with the graphs are awesome. I love graphs. I'm a sucker for graphs, but like his graphs are just so poignant. But like on page 17, he has a one-liner. A single decision is easy to dismiss. And he gives a couple examples of that. Like one meal doesn't make for your entire nutrition. But if you repeat that meal 100,000 times, guess what you're made of? You're all cheeseburgers, man. Like that was the choice you made every single day. Not once, like have a cheeseburger, but like you repeat that enough times, it becomes toxic. Just like in relationships, like you ignore your wife and kids one day, they will forgive you and say like, I understand, busy day, stressful. You do that every single day and it's like, you're never around. Who are you? We don't know you. I'm 16. You've never been around for anything that I've done. So goodbye, Dad. Don't care to see you at all,
Exactly. At the end of the road. Yeah. And I do like his example of, flights. Just like if you're off by a half a degree on a flight that's cross country, you're going to be hundreds of miles off from where you should be. I thought that was a good example too. Again, I do agree with you. I think his analogies and his stories are simple and poignant, and they get you to the point really quickly. So
Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting because that's a analogy that I have used a lot actually in sermons. Like you talk about things like sin, and it's like 1 degree off. Like there's a number of different words that in Hebrew that are used to describe that. One is like missing the mark with a shot from an arrow, and like if you shoot directly, like you're good, but like one of the concepts of sin biblically is like just off mark. And like if you're off mark by, an inch from a shooting position, the further out the target, the farther away that arrow is going to be from where it's supposed to be. And I think that's just a really interesting concept for us is like the starting place might not feel all that bad, but where you end up when you follow that same trajectory, it can be destructive.
yes, absolutely. I put on this section that at least for what we're going to do about it, how would I practically apply this? It reminded me of a quote from Ray Lewis, the linebacker in football, if you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic, like amazing linebacker in football. He preached that to get greatness at that sport, you need consistency and you need effort. And just those two words are something that I've applied to my own life. And they're two words that I apply and I preach to my students, where I'm just like, you guys, you're not going to be good. You're not going to get better at reading, vocabulary, math, whatever it is that we're doing, right? Unless you're giving it consistent effort. Like it's all about building the habits of being a student, because so many of them, they're young. They just think that like you either get it or you don't. I'm either bad at math or I'm good at math. And they don't know that it's consistent effort, and that failures should not get in the way of relentless learning. So that's something that stuck out to me too as well in that section.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's he uses the example of British cycling, which I didn't get into. Did you read the footnote on that? Because I'm really curious.
That was actually the only thing I wrote down that I disagreed with, and my note on it, which was funny, is because I wrote this before I got to his footnote. I said the example of cyclists is suspect at best, given its greater context, knowing that they're competing and looking for 1% advantages at any cost, but leaving out the rampant doping and the PED use in the sport seemed a bit disingenuous to me. And then I added a note once I saw his note, and I said, it appears he addresses this on his website in his blog.
Yeah. Did you look at the blog post?
I did not have time. What
Man, I didn't look at it either.
Okay, well that's.
But yeah, maybe go check it out. That might be something that he does address, and because he has a footnote about it. And maybe we'll make a comment on it next week.
Yeah.
But I was thinking the same thing. I was like, cyclists, Olympic athletes, all of that kind of stuff. Like that is a class that is so far. Here's the other thing about it is like that is so far removed from the daily life of an average person.
Yes.
Like take a cyclist. Right, and this is probably not the case because I don't know the sport as intimately as like American sports. But like, take any, not that cycling isn't American, but like it's not super popular here. Like if you take any of our like professional sport players and like stack them up against Dave who works next to you at the office, like their habits are different, not just because of like structured ways of thinking and being, but also because of like an insane amount of like privilege in that position to focus entirely on incremental gains. Like Dan, who sits next to you, like is not rewarded handsomely for making incremental gains, whereas like LeBron James is, so like it kind of like behooves him a little bit to press into that more. It makes me think about like where the rubber really meets the road here. And I think that like Clear actually addresses this objection of mine in his introduction a little bit with like, he opens with a story about his own life that is just from my perspective, insane.
Oh,
But
it's
he
tragic,
does,
horrible.
yeah, hit in the face with a baseball bat in ICU, sidelines his baseball career, basically bounces back, becomes college team captain, academic All-American. And his point is like, he was a high school player at the time, and I highlighted something from the introduction about what that period of life was like for him. And I just found this really powerful because it brought everything that he's talking about to a really critical, like, it gives it a lot of credence as you step into this. You're not thinking about, like, just British cycling team or, like, just professional athletes. He talks about, like, being 16, hit in the face with a baseball bat, and then he says, after a year of self-doubt, I managed to make the varsity team as a senior, but I rarely made it on the field, in page 5. It's like he gives context to the reality that a lot of us suffer through, which is like that latent potential trap can be much longer than we want. Like a year of self-doubt is a lot of pain to face. Like that's a lot of adversity.
Especially at that age, because he's so young.
And there's marginal gains there. Like he's 17, barely playing, but making the varsity team. Like that's not making $1 million contract. Mm-hmm. Like that's not winning, 7 championships in 7 years and the biggest sport stage in the world. Like that is just a very ordinary story of like overcoming adversity and not really feeling it. But then he goes to college and becomes an exceptional baseball player. Never becomes a professional baseball player, but becomes good, reaches his potential. And that, I think, is like, that's a hero's journey that we can all get on board with, Like, okay, I could see that happening in my own life, right?
Yeah, I do wonder if he gets more into when enough is enough, like the idea of the diminishing returns on this, because I agree with you in terms of in the terms that he's put it in so far, it is pretty separated from daily life. And the average person, the average, family person like us, like we don't have all of the free time in the world to focus on marginal gains in all of the aspects of our life. And for a lot of things, with the sports analogies, it's easy to see what 1% marginal gain is. And in a lot of activities, hobbies, or in a lot of things in your life, it's not as easy to see. How am I going to know that my relationship with my son is 1% better than it was before? Like not all those things are measurable in an easy sense. So I do wonder, where this book will take us in terms of that route too, in terms of practicality.
Yeah, that's so right. I mean, and like some of our behaviors and most important facets of our life, from my perspective, aren't measurable necessarily. Like you can almost never measure them really. You can just sort of long-term look back and go, oh, that was good that I've been doing that. Like a good example for me, pastoral counseling, I'm always, encouraging people to turn into spiritual habits. And the question is like, well, if I pray 5 minutes a day or not, what does that do? And the reality is like, you may never know, right? Like you may not really see, but you can sort of feel things. And, one of the challenges of this, and so maybe one of the things I disagreed with is like, I love the graphs in theory, but like, how do you measure if you're, like he talks about mathematically you reach 0 or mathematically you're 37 times better. And it's like a year from now, I won't know if I'm reaching 0 or if I'm 37 times better compared to what I am today. Like, how do I really measure that? And there are some like lagging markers for sure, like things you could point at and say like, oh yeah, I mean, I've got healthy relationships, but like, I don't know what you think about this, Weston, but like so much of my organized life in like work, vocation, school, whatever, has been like there are metrics to achieve and there are goals that need to be, assessed and reassessed. And he makes a pretty provocative statement that a goalless life is actually life.
Dude, I loved this section. Can I jump in here? Did you have any more to say?
Yeah.
Okay, this is actually where I wanted to go next. So I have been advocating against this process as an educator for years now, because when I first got in, the big thing was No Child Left Behind. These kids need goals. The teachers need goals, and they need accountability. They need to set a goal and reach for it. You know what that leads to? And you know what I've seen over my decade worth of educator experience? Almost never are those goals achieved. And almost never does it make anyone feel good. In large respect, the majority of the time, kids fail, teachers fail, schools fail because they set these goals without focusing on the process, without focusing on what are we actually trying to get the kids to do in habits, right? What are we trying to get the kids to repeatedly do, and what kind of mindset do we want them to have? And it's been one of my biggest gripes, because I get marked down as an educator if I don't go over a specific learning target and success criteria for that day. And I'm looking at it like, why is that even, our goal is to do this instead of to focus on, sometimes they allow goals that are discussion based and stuff like that, right? But it's I don't see the benefit of it. And currently I have that because I've been forced to implement it. And my note was, for an action item for myself personally, I want to rethink how I frame my weekly goals with my students. And I want to kind of reframe them, or think of a good way to reframe them, as system improvements or habitual improvements. But I need to think of a kid-friendly term that makes sense for that. But overall, my big takeaway for action is that I need to reframe my weekly meetings with the kids, because right now I set them up, and again, this is radical anyways, but I set them up to have a mind goal for the week, a heart goal for the week, and a body goal for the week, because I want them to understand that they need to focus on their whole person, and that learning, a big majority of how you learn is how you feel. So your body needs to feel good. You need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and that academic learning is not everything. So a lot of my kids' heart goals, which have been really cool to talk about over the years, are things like building relationships with siblings or cousins that are far away, or building relationships with their parents in a more authentic way. So I think that just focusing on that has been really good, but I want to reframe it instead of a goal, make it, some sort of term that I can think. And then the other thing I said with the book is that I definitely felt validated, because I think what you said is right. It's provocative. Not a lot of people think this, and I felt validated, dude, I've been doing this for years in my pushback against these things, like the learning targets, success criteria, or SMART goals that are pretty obvious or used a lot in corporate America. I've never felt they're healthy, and especially given the context of the demographic I work with. I work in a Title I school, so if you don't know what that is, it just means I work in a lower income area, so you can do a bunch of research on that, but anyways, so because kids naturally compare themselves to each other and to the standards, and I just don't think that's a healthy way that they should live. And I actually had some data to back this up, because I don't like making claims without data. I'll be sure to put this on the screen in the video, but basically, some evidence for why this is horrible. Number one, it's the standards and these goals that specifically our state has set is too high for the majority of students in the state. Less than half of our students in the state in public education pass the reading and math standardized tests, and we have to think about what that does to our students' psyches after years of this. They take this 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and then they take it in 8th grade, and they take it in 10th grade, right? Here's the example for just last year, the data from last year, because for some reason, these standardized test makers just don't think about this. But they make, it's on a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. 3 means you passed it, you did really good for your age, you should progress to the next level, right? But what they don't understand is that they make it a percentile. So the data that I looked up, and I'll have the link in the description so you can go scour this website yourself, because it's all public knowledge, because it's all publicly available. In ELA, which is English Language Arts, you must be in the 76th percentile or higher to get a passing grade. To get a passing grade, right? And in math, you must have been, this again is just for last year, and you can look at the historical examples. In math, you must have been in the 71st percentile or higher to get a passing grade. But then they wonder why kids don't want to learn or don't have a good attitude about school, because every year they get these standardized tests back, and the parents get a little form that we have to pass out to them that says, like, your student did not meet passing. And it's like, dude, it's only 76% or 72% of our kids in reading and math are getting the bad note, saying that their kid is not good enough, right? And then it's too comparative to use goals in a lot of situations. And just, I don't know, this is maybe another note that is a little bit on tangent here, but it's too comparative to use statewide examples when there's affluent districts and there's not affluent districts, and they have more resources and support than the students do, than I do as a teacher. I've always tried to help my students focus on internal motivation rather than external motivation, which is very difficult to do because of the world we live in. They see social media now. You know, all these kids have phones when they're in like 4th grade is like the average now. And they see perfection on social media. They see other kids that have blown up on YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is, right? And they think that they need to be doing that too. They think that it's an attainable goal or a realistic goal. So that's why I'm interested to see where James Clear takes this in the book. I'm
all for that, because one of the things that Clear mentions is, like, goals create a binary. We're either meeting our goal or we're failing at our goal. And it's like, it's a harsh binary.
Yes.
The reality is, like, you set a goal, say, like, take New Year's resolutions, for instance, like, I'm going to read more. Well, you set yourself a goal. I'm going to read 15 books a week. If you read 11, at the end of the year, you say, oh, I didn't accomplish my goal. I failed. And it's like, well, you read 11 books. How many did you read this year? 1? None. Like, give yourself some credit. And, like, I think that it's in our personal goals that we most easily recognize the harmful effects of this, but we don't see, or we don't, like, we can do this for ourselves. Like, how many years do we have to set New Year's resolutions and give up on them by February to start realizing that, like, maybe our corporate structures shouldn't retarget goals in January and then reset them every quarter? Like, maybe that's the problem, is the goal setting, because that is creating a feeling of unproductivity. And whatever you tell yourself is what's going to happen, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy. It's interesting how applicable this stuff is immediately when you start thinking about it. Is like a lot of churches do this, where, like, they're measuring numbers and they're judging themselves by that. It's like, don't judge the numbers, judge the quality, right? Like, but then the question becomes, and this is my big pushback on this, goalless living and stuff. And I don't actually agree. So I'm just going to play devil's advocate with you, Weston.
Okay.
If we can't measure, if we can't set goals, what do we do? Like, how do we, like, actually run an efficient society? How do we run an efficient education system, even an efficient household, if we don't have these long-range goals? Like, or if we don't have systems of measurement to ensure that we're, like, measuring up? How do we do that?
I think that right there is the key that you just said. I think the way that we measure things needs to change. And I do think long-term goals are fantastic. And the hard thing to balance is because goals in themselves are not necessarily bad. I think it's the way that our mindset approaches those goals is what we need to fix, right? Because, it's good to have goals. Like, we want to make a home improvement and redo our master bathroom, right? That's a goal that we have. And it's not bad to have that goal. But the deadlines, I think, are what are deadly to us in a lot of ways in making it binary, right? Because one of the things that at least I've seen in my life, when one of my big things in life is knowing that progress is not linear. Like, you are not going to be able to maintain any sort of linear progress for any sustained amount of time in the long term. So it's going to take, like he talks about in this first chapter, it's going to take incremental jumps at some point. But I think the time aspect and the deadline aspect is maybe something that we need to get away from. And I don't know how to change corporate America, because there's a reason that I'd never wanted to be in corporate America. So I apologize for not having great advice for that. I just know that in terms of what I see with students and young people as they're developing, is that the more binary you make things, the more pressure there is. And not that there shouldn't be pressure, and that's the hard thing. I think everything's just a balance, right? There should be pressure. There should be pressure to grow, because if there isn't pressure to grow, you end up with, looking at yourself 10 years, 15 years from now saying, oh my God, I've turned into a slob. What is this? What have I done? So I think it just needs to be balanced more in terms of achievement focused. I think that's the thing I have the issue with, is that there's a lack of, or rather too much focus on you must achieve this by this time, by this age, right? So many of us, and especially me at a younger age too, compared my success and my trajectory in life to where others had been in their life, and immediately just feeling like a failure.
Oh yeah.
Even though I had my whole life ahead of me. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Like, he talks about this, that feeling of failure, I think, is the biggest problem. So I was thinking about SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-based, right? It's the time-based piece that is really the challenge there. Because here's what we do. This is the problem with goal setting. We aim too high.
Yes.
We aim too high. And we expect that time frame to be extremely short. But something I've been saying for years, and actually this is a principle that I picked up from John Maxwell, I think, but it's not his idea. It's even older idea that was like the people underestimate what they can accomplish in a long amount of time, but they overestimate what they can accomplish in a short amount of time. The reality is, and I read this somewhere recently, I think actually James Clear writes about it on his blog, and I got it from another one of his blog posts. I would like to say that I have the reference for this, but I don't. But I was recently reading, it may even be Y Combinator. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But this was a blog by, I think a venture capitalist in the development arena, like software development, who is saying, you will accomplish a task in the time you set for it. I think that is a really interesting concept that maybe Clear will get into in later chapters or something. But it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. If I say I want to paint a fence and I give myself the whole weekend, I'll paint the fence in the weekend, and it's going to be like well painted. I'm going to be super tired. I'm going to have long days of painting the fence. I'm going to feel like that weekend was shot. I painted my fence. But if I say, you know what, I'm just going to bust this thing out Saturday morning, you will still have a painted fence. Like, you will just get it done in 4 hours if you set that time constraint on yourself. The problem is that works with small things. That doesn't work with large things. And we're really bad at telling the difference between those things as people. Like, for us, we think like take for instance, I use that example of like church metrics, right? Like, imagine my church measures ourselves in numbers, like numbers of people. We have 50 people today. By the end of the quarter, we want to have 300. That seems fine. Like, seems totally possible we could do that. Could we multiply it by 6? Like, I don't know. Sure, why not? 6 is a number smaller than 10. Like, doesn't seem all that crazy. But like, when you start thinking about it, like that would be an insane goal to set. But companies set goals like this all the time. We've had 14 years of continuous marginal revenue improvement. Let's have a 15th. We've been growing by 30% year over year the last 2 years. let's grow by 60% this year. That seems like it makes sense. But the reality is those are nonsensical goals. Like, they're not rooted in reality. They're too large for us to comprehend. And then when we fail at them, we feel like we missed the mark. And one of the problems with big goals like this is we, like, take the common example that everybody sets for themselves of losing 10 pounds. Losing 10 pounds seems like a totally reasonable thing to do. And if you say, I'm going to lose 10 pounds by the end of January, at the beginning of January, you start off, you run a couple days, you don't see the scale dropping at all, right? And then you go a couple days without doing it, you check on the first week, oh, man, my weight's exactly the same. The next week you get a little bit motivated, you do it a couple times, you run a couple times, go to the gym, don't see the scale moving, you check the next Friday. Man, the next week you just don't go to the gym at all. And then you've actually gained weight. And then at the end of that second week, you're 1 pound heavier or whatever. That goal becomes more elusive. The closer it gets, the tighter the deadline is my point. And I guess my point is this, like, in the law of large numbers, which is where, like, most of our, like, corporate thinking goes, the concepts are too big for us to understand on an individual level. And so we apply that same kind of thinking to our individual lives, and it causes ruin for us because we think, like, oh, I need to be, striving or something, or, like, we expect that we should have 30% year-over-year growth because that's what our company is achieving, right? And so there's this disconnect from reality. I think you're absolutely right. Like, to me, the challenge would be, can we break down these goals? Can we, like, measure things in a more realistic sense? Like, maybe that's something that could be done.
I would have to disagree. This might be too esoteric, but I don't think the goals, like, I do think the goals are an issue when you're looking at yourself, or, like, I guess what I want to say is externalized goals for externalized things are pretty good, but in terms of internal goals that you have, you shouldn't have any internal goals. And let me leave you with this. I think this will probably be where we wrap up the podcast. Life is about the journey, not the destination. And I think in a lot of ways we need to appreciate the journey and live in the moment, rather than focusing on some goal or some external thing that we're trying to get to. Because if that's your focus, you're missing out all the beauty right underneath your feet. Right?
That's great. That's great. Okay, so what are we going to do with this?
I know that for me, my clear objective within the next few weeks is to reframe my goals for my students and my weekly process that we do with them. Because every week we set a goal on Mondays, and then we have a class meeting about those on Fridays, and we talk about them throughout the week. So I want to reframe those a little bit.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
What about you?
I think for me, this really motivates me to take those 1% gains and just apply those to the buckets of my life. I think about life in buckets often because I think that that's helpful, where you have, like, finances, your family, your friends, your social, right? And then you have food, which is like your body. And then you have what I would say would be force, which is like work, right? So you have those five, I call them Fs, 5 Fs, right? Buckets that I can kind of, like, think about, how could I move all of these things forward 1%? Like, what is the action I could take in each one of these places to just move forward 1%? With my family, with my friends, with my force or my labor, my work, with my finances, and then I think I missed this one, but faith. Like, with, like, what is that 1% gain that you can, take to just move forward? So that's going to be my exercise, is just to, like, sit down. And this is the thing, is, like, it's still goal setting. Like, it's still going to take me some time to sit down and, like, do this and say like, okay, well, what is the thing? But it's so much simpler because it's just saying like, okay, what's one step forward look like? That's easy for me to wrap my mind around. And more than that, and more importantly than that, I think this is James Clear's whole point. I can actually do it. Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.